Hey there, and welcome back to the podcast. I'm so glad you tuned in today. Today, we're going to be talking about container gardening and specifically growing in grow bags. Container gardening is appealing for many gardeners these days, and growing in grow bags is a way that many container gardeners grow in containers. But whether you garden entirely in containers or whether you supplement a raised bed garden or an in-ground garden with grow bags like I do, grow bags are not without their challenges. However, they're still honestly my container of choice in many ways. And today I'm going to answer many of the questions that beginners have asked me, as well as give you some guidelines to help you be more successful in growing with grow bags. Now stick around to the end because I asked my Instagram community, what questions do you have about growing in grow bags? And even though I had already outlined everything that I was going to share with you today, they had some fabulous questions. And the ones that aren't already answered in what I'm sharing with you in the main part of the podcast, I'm going to be answering them at the end. So make sure and tune in because we've got some really great questions coming up. So today, let's talk about how to grow successfully in grow bags. First off, if you're a new gardener, you may not exactly know what I'm talking about when I'm referring to grow bags. When we grow in grow bags, I'm not talking about potato sacks or growing in grocery store sacks. I've seen that online as well, or even other bags. We are specifically talking about grow bags or grow fabric containers, or Smart Pots is a brand name that are sold specifically to grow crops. These grow bags are made of a woven material, and most of them, especially the ones that are made to be able to last more than a season, are made also with a woven material with food grade plastics. Now, this probably causes a concern to some people, so be sure to look up the manufacturer that you're buying from just to see what those are made out of. But most of the time, at least the ones that I have looked at recently, they're made with plastics that are deemed to be food grade or food safe. But again, that's definitely something to consider if that is a concern for you. Me personally, I have grown in grow bags for many years. I've used Smart Pots, that brand that I mentioned before. I've also used a random kind that I got on sale off Amazon years ago. I cannot tell you probably what it was made out of. I just know it's lasted a really long time. And then this year I'm growing using Epic Gardening's grow bags, which so far I'm really enjoying. And I'm specifically using their lined grow bags. And I'll talk to you more about that when we're talking about drainage. But in particular these days, the manufacturers, at least the good ones, are going to be transparent about what their grow bags are made out of. That's why I'm very confident in especially the Epic Gardening ones, because I've done some research on that, and hopefully that will be a really good option for me this year. So why grow in grow bags? One question I did get on Instagram is, why would you even want to choose to grow in grow bags as opposed to pots? And I think that's a really good question. The reason that I like to grow in grow bags mainly is because they are lightweight. The bags themselves they're not heavy at all, as opposed to stone or terracotta or something like that, especially if you get into larger bags. The lightweight is really helpful. And then they are portable. And to me, that's a huge deal. Most of the ones I have now have handles, and that makes it where I can take them from place to place whenever I need to. I find that I do this a lot when it comes to utilizing my greenhouse. I will grow crops early in my greenhouse in these grow bags, and then I'll take them out when the threat of frost has passed. I did that with tomatoes. I did that with potatoes this year, but I also did it with potatoes last year. I grew them outside, and then when we had a freeze, I put them into the greenhouse to cover, and that makes them really easy because they are portable. Now, the bigger of a grow bag that you get, obviously the more heavy it's going to be with soil, but I definitely have found them to be more lightweight and more portable than regular pots, especially, like I said, the clay or stone or heavy pots. Another thing is that they're relatively inexpensive. I know that you can get cheap pots at Lowe's, like the plastic ones. I'll tell you, I have never, at least the ones that I've bought, like the cheapest ones with the little drainage thing that doesn't work all that well. I've killed more plants using those cheap pots. So I know you can get cheaper ones, but the good quality pots are going to be a lot more expensive. Have you priced planters? I mean, they can be really expensive, especially if you're buying them this time of year. So grow bags are more economical per bag, and a lot of times you're going to be buying them in like packs of 5. So you're getting quite a few for the same price that you might pay for one planter. They're also really easy to store in the off season. I don't always dump out my grow bag soil at the end of the year, but if I needed the space or if I decided to for some reason, you can dump out the soil and then just flatten them and store them. They're super easy to store in the off season. And one big reason that grow bags are a good choice is that they drain extremely well. My biggest mistakes as a container gardener were made when I used pots that didn't drain well. And I realized it was because it wasn't necessarily that I was overwatering, although that could be the case too, but especially in the spring, we get a lot of rain. And when you have a container that doesn't drain well, that water is just going to stay in that container and the roots are going to rot. And you're not going to understand why your plant isn't growing very well. A lot of times they show the same symptoms of being underwatered as they do being overwatered. And so maybe you'll water them more. We've all been there and all done that. And for me, that has not been an issue with grow bags, just because they drain so well, they shed their water so well, which makes it a really good choice, especially in our rainy spring. Now, going to the drawbacks of grow bags, it's kind of the opposite side of the same coin. It can drain too well, which while the good drainage in the spring when you get heavy rains is a fantastic feature, it can also be a little bit frustrating in the summer, especially when your potting soil starts to get hydrophobic, which means it has a hard time retaining moisture. This happens when potting soil ages and also when your roots are starting to grow out into the potting soil. Sometimes it's hard to keep them watered. So that's definitely a challenge. And that's a question that's come up many times. We're going to talk more about that in the do's and don'ts because the watering is definitely something to address with grow bags. Another thing that I've noticed, especially in my Arkansas summers, is that I found that the soil temperature in the grow bags will rise higher in the heat of the summer. Part of this is because the grow bags that I've used in the past are black. Part of this is because I grew probably too big of a plant in the grow bag. We'll talk about that in a minute too. And so it was wicking up all the moisture really fast. And so it just ends up drying out and the soil temperature rises and all that. So there are ways to mitigate that, but that's definitely an issue, especially if you live in an area where you get really hot and really dry in the summer. The soil temperature rising can definitely affect the health of your crops. Now that we've talked about what grow bags are, the benefits and the drawbacks, let's talk about some do's and don'ts. Most of this comes from my personal experience and also what I've seen other gardeners do. The first do, especially if you're just beginning with grow bags, buy the right size of a grow bag for what you want to grow. Grow bags will come in sizes of 5 gallon, 7 gallon, 10 gallon, 50 gallon, 15 gallon, all the way up to 60 gallon. And so sometimes you may be wondering, okay, well, what size do I need to buy? And I have been there. I've definitely done the same thing. So here's what you need to know about what size that you want to buy based on the crops that you want to grow. Small crops like carrots, lettuce, onions, greens, any of those can grow in just about any size of pot that you have, even a 5-gallon pot. The only thing that you need to do is you need to adjust the quantity. So you would obviously grow fewer carrots in a 5-gallon pot than you would a 15-gallon pot, right? And we're going to talk about how many and all that in just a minute. But I think what I found is a bigger mistake, and I definitely have made it, is that larger crops like tomatoes, cucumbers, squash, and potatoes, they need a larger size. I would say a minimum of 7 gallon, but I say that with a huge asterisk. That is the largest grow bag that I have grown in up until this year when I bought some 15-gallon Epic Gardening grow bags. And those crops, tomatoes, cucumbers, squash, potatoes, they've done well enough in the 7-gallon. But over the years, I've found that I really think those crops need more than a 7-gallon. If you're growing any of those, I think a 10 or 15-gallon grow bag would be way more preferable, especially if you live in a hot area. We're going to talk about that in just a minute. But definitely for the larger crops, you need a larger grow bag. And when it comes to how many crops to grow in a grow bag, use general plant spacing guidelines. The guidelines that you see on a seed packet, or if you're in my Dream to Garden course, I give you plant spacing, that common crop cheat sheet, you have your plant spacing guides. Use those same guides between plants. Ignore the amount, the space between rows. So a lot of time, seed catalogs, seed packets are going to say, plant every 6 inches and then 3 feet between rows. Obviously, you don't need that for containers, grow bags, but want to make sure you know that. But use the plant spacing guide per plant in containers. It works both with containers, raised beds, ground beds are all going to be the same. In general, your potatoes are going to be 12 inches apart. Your carrots are going to be 2 inches apart. So basically use those same plant spacing guidelines. Now, I will tell you that when I observe different people, different gardeners growing in grow bags, I see overcrowding the bags more often than I see underutilizing the bags, if that makes sense. And it makes perfect sense why we would want to do that, especially when plants are small or planting seeds. I know just the other day I went to my 15-gallon grow bag, and I know that I just need probably 1 cucumber, because I've seen what a cucumber can do to a 7-gallon grow bag. And I thought I probably will just need 1 plant, 2 at the max. But I couldn't bring myself to just plant 1 or 2 seeds. I ended up planting 3, and I know it's going to be hard, but I'm going to have to cull at least one of them. So when we're planting small little transplants or we're planting seeds, it's really hard not to overplant, but understand that with a grow bag, just like any other container, what you have is all those roots can access. That means nutrients, that means water. So overcrowding is going to mean that they're going to compete with one another, and putting more plants in a grow bag can sometimes, probably more often than not, make it where your total harvest is less than if you would have gone with a fewer amount of plants to begin with. So like I said, overcrowding is probably a bigger temptation than underutilizing the grow bag. So I would definitely focus on plant spacing, and when in doubt, truly less is more. The second do is to select the right soil mixture. Now, this is going to be my personal opinion based on my experience with grow bags. I absolutely use a base of potting mix or potting soil, because it is still a container. You do still need it to be able to drain well. You do not want to use raised bed soil or garden soil. It's still going to be too heavy of a texture for the container. However, where you might only do potting soil in a regular container, or your green stalk vertical planter, for instance, because you want it to be light and fluffy and the drainage to be really good. If you recall, I said that sometimes it drains too well. I have found that adding a little bit of a heavier composition soil with the potting mix helps to balance that out. This may be compost. You may add a little bit of compost. One thing I'm trying this year is soil conditioner. I bought it's called soil conditioner from Happy Frog. I think I bought it at my local farmer's co-op. It's a little bit heavier. It's got a little bit more bark content. You could even use a little bit of garden soil. Personally, it kind of depends on how heavy your input is. The compost that I buy in bulk tends to be pretty light. So I may go up to 1/3 of compost and then 2/3 of potting soil. But if I were to use, clay-based heavy topsoil, I wouldn't use more than a couple of maybe shovels full, like little shovels full. I wouldn't use much at all. All that to say, I like to add a little bit more of a heavier ingredient in my grow bags just to be able to retain the water a little bit better. But I never want to go overboard, because having too dense of a soil in a grow bag is going to potentially cause root rot, and we definitely don't want that. The next thing that you need to do, and this is something that I did just over the weekend, is think through the location that you put your grow bags relative to irrigation. Now, this is going to be more important the larger that you get your grow bags, because I would say the 7-gallon grow bags were fairly easy to move from place to place, even when they were full of soil and plants. But now that I've got 15-gallon grow bags, I know those are going to be so heavy, I'm not going to want to move them. If I needed to, I would obviously get my husband or my son to help me out. But I really want them to be in the place that they're going to be most of the season. And when I was trying to decide where I wanted them to go, I had to think through where I was going to, or how I was going to irrigate them. Because, as we mentioned, Grow bags drain so well that you're gonna have to keep them watered probably more frequently than any other container. And to do that, is if you've got your grow bags really far away from your water source, then it's going to be a pain, and you're not going to want to do it in the middle of the summer. I can promise you. Well, unless you're one of those people who loves going outside and watering their plants by hand. If that's you, then you can ignore this tip. But for me, I'm like, oh man, I have to go out there again, because most likely, if you don't have rain in the middle of the summer, you're probably going to have them watered every day. So be prepared to irrigate. That's my next do. Kind of goes along with that. Not only do you need to think through the location, making sure that it's as convenient as you can get it, but you also need to be prepared to irrigate. A lot of people do hand watering. That's what I did for years. Understanding that it's a little bit more tricky to hand water grow bags. And this is a question that someone had actually posed, is that every time they hand water their grow bag, it just weeps out the sides. And it's kind of hard to see, is the water actually getting into the soil? And sometimes that can absolutely happen. It can happen early in the season when your potting mix hasn't been saturated yet. It can happen in the middle of the season when it's so hot, the soil has become hydrophobic, and then it just weeps out the sides. The best tip that I've ever received was from Kevin Espiritu of Epic Gardening when he was on the podcast years ago with his book, Grow Bag Gardening. His method is to water, wait, water. So basically, you water a little bit, you wait for it to sink in. While you're waiting, you might go on to another grow bag, and then you come back to it. Basically, you can't just accept that you're going to just water once and be done. It takes time to percolate, and it takes a little bit longer to water if you're hand watering. One tip that I would suggest that worked really well for me the last couple of years is to put your grow bags in some sort of a tub. For me, I used a radio flower wagon that I've had since I was probably 3 years old. And I put my 7-gallon grow bags in that radio flower wagon, and I would not only be able to water from the top and then know that if it wept out the sides, that the plant would still be able to take it up from the bottom. But in the summer, I just started watering from the bottom. I just started filling that wagon with a couple inches of soil, and it would wick up. And that worked really well. And I feel like my plants were a little bit more healthy because they didn't ever get too dried out. So any kind of tub, obviously the radio flower wagon was an attractive thing. You could use any kind of plastic tote, but that's something that I found was a little bit more of a shortcut there. This year I'm doing something a little bit different because I added 5 Epic Gardening grow bags. I bought their lined bags, and my hope is that their lined bags will help prevent some of that weeping out of the sides, but also insulate the sides so it doesn't get so hot. The soil temperature doesn't get so hot. But a really neat feature they included on these lined grow bags is on, I think it's 3 sides. When I looked at it, they have this little pocket where you can snake a drip line tube up the pocket, and then it comes out the top. So it makes it more of a tidy thing. Now I've got mine where my tubes are in the back, so you can't really see them. But if you have your grow bags where you can see wherever any kind of tubing is, it makes it a lot more handy and neat looking. So I really liked that. And I've got those drip lines now set up with my regular irrigation. And then when I put everything on timers, they will automatically water, which I'm really excited about. I've never had grow bags on a timer, so this will be great this year. But that's something that definitely keep in mind, is to be prepared to irrigate. Another thing that you want to do is to plan to fertilize. Remember that the soil that the plant has, it's all it's going to be able to have to be able to get all the nutrients it needs. And also, because it drains so well, a lot of those nutrients will flush out a lot quicker than they would if you were growing in a raised bed or in the ground. What I like to do is I put a slow release fertilizer in the mix. I typically will use something like Garden Tone or Plant Tone, and I'll put that in the mix before I even plant. And then a good idea is to use some kind of liquid fertilizer every couple of weeks, whether you do something organic like Organic Rev's Eco Organic, or you use something like Fox Farms' Grow Big. That would be another one that I would suggest for containers. But I would recommend to plan on fertilizing every couple of weeks. And if you have Organic Rev, the same thing. I would do that every couple of weeks until flowering. Usually that's when it gets the best results. So those are the do's. Let's move on to the don'ts. Thankfully, we don't have as many don'ts here, but this is definitely something to consider to help you get better success. Number one, this kind of goes along with one of the do's, but don't plant too many in one bag. This is the biggest mistake that I've seen people make, is planting too many crops in one bag. I was guilty of this a couple of years ago. I threw like 3 sweet potato slips in a 7-gallon grow bag. That is crazy. It needed 1, maybe. Another thing I've seen people do is plant 2 or 3 squash seedlings in a grow bag, like 7 or 10 gallon even. 2 that'll be pushing it. But in general, you're going to want 1 squash or 1 cucumber or 1 tomato in a grow bag. Now, depending on how big you get, you can consider that you might be able to get 2. But again, the bigger mistake is overplanting rather than underplanting. And for me, I keep trying to test different things out. One year I put 2 seed potatoes in a 7-gallon grow bag. One year I put 1 seed potato. Now I'm going to be doing 2 seed potatoes in a 15-gallon grow bag, and I'm just going to see what kind of results I get with all of that. So you may have to play a little bit with it, but based on my experience, I would recommend, again, less is more. Another thing for you to don't do is don't plant in too small of a bag, especially in long, hot climates. So here's an example. I told you that over the last several years, I've planted tomatoes in 7-gallon grow bags, 1 tomato plant per grow bag. And at the beginning of the season, they did well. They did great. They produced. But toward the middle of the season, which is when we started getting hotter and when the plant itself was a lot more mature, I noticed production consistently started to decline. Now, that sometimes can happen with tomatoes, but I noticed that it was happening more in my grow bags than it was in raised beds or in my ground. So I realized that the difference was the grow bag. And then at the end of the season, or actually when it stopped producing and I was done with babying it for not getting anything, I would take the plant out of the grow bag and the roots had just expanded that entire 7 gallons. And that's when I realized that I really needed to bump up the space that tomato got. Yes, it produced, but it produced a small amount of time and it could have produced more. At least that's my theory. I'm testing it this year in a 15-gallon grow bag. It could have produced more if it had more space. And the reason I say, especially if you live in long, hot climates, is because I think because we plant our tomatoes in April and they could feasibly go through the end of October, that's a long time to be able to support those roots for a growing plant. But if you have a smaller growing season, a smaller window, and maybe your tomatoes aren't growing as rapidly, and maybe you're not as hot where the moisture isn't being taken up so quickly, a 7-gallon may be fine for you. But for me, in the long, hot summer of Arkansas, I'm realizing that a 7-gallon was probably a little bit too small. But test it in your own garden, as I always recommend. Next, don't forget to irrigate or fertilize. This goes back to what I mentioned before, but that's definitely something don't forget to do, especially in the heat. You're probably going to need to water daily in the heat. Another thing don't let plants overstay their welcome. Start over. This is something that we all struggle with, but especially in grow bags. You've got a plant that still looks good, it's still growing, but it's just not producing as much. I've noticed that with cucumbers and tomatoes in particular with grow bags, and it's so hard to take it out. But if they're not producing like you want them to, and especially if they've had a good life, take them out. Plant something new. You will be glad that you did rather than trying to baby a plant that's not producing for you. Another don't think that you have to replace the entire soil with each new planting. That's the thing that people want to know is, what do I do with the container soil that I've already had? And that would be the case with containers or grow bags, is you don't have to start all over every season. What I normally do is I like to keep about half of it and then add new ingredients for the other half. That way I'm injecting new fertility, better structure, especially if you use a peat-based potting mix. That peat-based mix tends to get a little bit more hydrophobic, so I like to mix it with a new fresh mix. So don't feel like, though, that you are one and done. but you can replace about half at least every season. But if you do plant several times a season, I would recommend that you at least replace some of it with every new planting if you're doing succession planting in grow bags like you would in your regular garden. And then finally, don't forget vertical supports if necessary. I'm going to camp on this for just a little bit because this is really important, and it's honestly something that I don't always consider when I'm planting in grow bags. But if you're planting especially tomatoes, cucumbers, or beans in grow bags, which are very common, you need to have an idea how you're going to support those plants. So here are some options for tomatoes. What I'm doing this year is I found a tomato cage that I've had in my garden for a long time, but it's a larger tomato cage. I put it on the outside of the grow bag. So this was a larger cage. It's going on the outside of a 15-gallon grow bag, but I put this tomato cage on the outside of the grow bag so that the tomatoes can have that support there. Another thing that you can do is, especially if you are growing or you're putting your grow bag somewhere that's next to ground soil, you can put a stake in the ground right next to the grow bag and then tie that tomato up to the stake. I have tried this putting a stake inside the grow bag, and it never works all that well because that soil in your grow bag is potting soil, and so it's not very firm. It's not like your ground soil, and a lot of times that stake will shift and it just won't provide much support. So I would do something like a rebar or T-post or something really strong. In the past years, I had a deck and I would put my grow bags right next to the deck and I would tie the tomatoes off on the deck. So something that you can tie them off on. One thing that I've done in the past is I've put 2 stakes. If you think one stake isn't enough, especially if you're growing a really viney indeterminate tomato, put 2 stakes on either side and do like a little Florida weave, like I do on my Roma tomatoes. Do a little Florida weave to keep them up. Make sure that those stakes are sturdy because it will become heavy. And then another option, if you've got several grow bags, and you could do this with buckets or containers or anything really, but if you've got lots of different plants of tomatoes, I saw this, Joe Lampel did this with his grow bags, is put a cattle panel trellis behind the grow bags and then tie up your tomatoes to the cattle panel trellis. That's definitely an option as well. Cucumbers, it's going to be some of the same options, although you don't technically have to have a trellis for cucumbers. You can let it sprawl. This might be something you want to do if you're growing on a deck or a patio. If you're growing on the ground, it will be a little bit more difficult to keep it mowed and keep bugs off of it and that kind of thing. But if you're on a deck or a patio, letting it sprawl, if you're okay with that, would be an option. You can also do a cage on the inside or the outside. That's what I do with mine. And you could also do the cattle panel behind it. That works with cucumbers as well. And then if you do beans, same thing. Beans can climb up the cage on the inside or the outside, cattle panel behind. You could even, do a teepee or something with bamboo shoots or bamboo stakes. I've seen that as well. So the whole point is just to find something that will support the plant that's growing in the grow bag. All right, so finally, let's go to the questions that I got from my Instagram people. And some of these questions may be similar to ones that you have had. So Carissa asked how to best clean and store the grow bags. She says, mine have green algae-like growth that looks horrible. I have only had that experience one time, 1 year, and I got some castile soap and a brush. I can't remember if it was a toothbrush or a scrubbing brush, probably a scrubbing brush, but using water and castile soap. I can't remember if I had any kind of abrasive substance. I don't think that I did. I think it was just that. And it came off really quickly. So that's what I used. It wasn't the most fun chore in the world, but it was pretty easy to be able to get that algae-like growth off of that. The next question came from My Backyard Garden, and he or she said, how do I keep them from drying out so fast? So that's a really common issue, especially in the summer. One thing that you can do is you can put all your grow bags together and they kind of start insulating each other, which helps to prevent the sunlight from drying them out from the outside if you get them close to each other. Another thing that you could do is this may be something that you'd have to be creative about, but think about if your grow bags are black or dark colored, they're going to absorb the heat. Maybe find a way to put some kind of reflector of some sort to reflect some of the heat. Those are some options. If it's a crop that can take a little shade, a shade cloth would be something that would help a little bit. Ultimately, I would say if you keep them watered so that the soil doesn't become hydrophobic. That would be the goal, is to keep them watered so that doesn't happen. Because usually when a soil becomes hydrophobic, it's because it was allowed to dry out. But if you keep it moist, then that's less likely to happen as quickly. Nancy says, do you need to hill potatoes or just put in a bag and cover with soil to the top? And she's growing Yukon Gold. So the thing is that I didn't realize this, but it depends on if your potato is a determinate or indeterminate, but most, and I believe Yukon Gold is determinate, which means it's not that it's going to keep growing potatoes on the stem. So it's not entirely necessary if you're growing a determinate. However, I do that. I do hill my potatoes in a grow bag, partly because potatoes don't like the heat, and any kind of heat, especially warming up of the soil, can affect tuber growth. I do like to hill it up mainly to be able to add some buffer insulation so it doesn't get so hot. So yes, I do hill mine even if they are determinate potatoes. Next, I have Eva, and she said, could I fit more than one cauliflower? So what you want to do is you want to follow plant spacing guidelines. And if I'm not mistaken, cauliflower is recommended about 18 inches apart. And two, they are very heavy feeders. So it depends on what size of your grow bag, but if you're doing like a 7 or 10 gallon, I would say one. What you'll find, because they're such heavy feeders, is you may have trouble fitting more than one in there and still getting a good harvest. I've not grown cauliflower in a grow bag. I've actually never grown cauliflower successfully. I planted a couple this year. We'll see how they do. So I'm speaking more on my opinion watching how broccoli grows, and broccoli and cauliflower are kind of similar as far as they're still breasts because they're heavy feeders and they're kind of particular, especially. The next one is Mama Pris & Co. says, have you grown blueberries in bags? We have alkaline soil here. I have not, because we have acidic soil here, but I would imagine you could grow blueberries in bags as long as you chose a big enough bag, and I would be careful on what variety of blueberry you choose. I know mine, they are rabbit eye blueberries and they get really, really large. So I would make sure that you get one that's not going to have a really large growth habit, and then make sure you get a large enough grow bag. And then finally, Mona says, with 15-pound bags, do they make platform bases big enough so that you can roll them around? I personally have not seen that. I'm sure that they're out there, but one thing that I have seen that you might be able to do is to get or make one of those like furniture dollies. You know what I'm talking about? We use it to, move around furniture sometime, but basically it's like some pieces of lumber that are, I'm here. If you're on YouTube, you can see me talking about it with my hands, but the lumber that you put together and then you put wheels on the bottom, like caster wheels, to me, that would be a pretty easy DIY project. But also just buying one from Lowe's. I don't know how expensive they are. It may be counterintuitive to do that, but I don't know about like the nice looking pretty ones. I know that this mover spinner bases that Greenstock offers for their green stalks, but also doubles for containers. I don't think those would be big enough for a 15-pound bag. They would be big enough for a 7-gallon, but the 15-pound bags are going to be a little bit more. But those were fantastic questions on grow bags. And whether you have a whole lot of space and you just use grow bags to supplement what you already have, or you're growing primarily in containers, I'm hoping that what I shared with you today helped to be able to get you some tips that you needed to be able to be more successful with them, and also be open to some of the challenges with grow bags as well. So if you have any questions or any comments, if you enjoy this episode, I'll be posting it on Instagram today. Just reply to that story and let me know what you learned, and if you have any tips, because if you've grown in grow bags, I would love to hear them from you. So thank you so much for joining me today on the podcast, and I hope you have a fabulous day.